Good morning, everyone. This is Dan, and this is the Napkin Academy. And I have to tell you that this is my favorite chapter that I've ever written. We're going to introduce the vivid concept of form. The idea here is pretty simple. I believe that our ideas are like clouds. They're kind of fluffy. We only remember those that really have form. And what I mean by that is, if we think about it, let's say that we're in a meeting and someone mentions one particular idea. Oh, isn't it nice outside today? And someone mentions another idea. Oh, I was walking down the beach. And someone mentions another idea. And what's interesting is, as the meeting's going on, these ideas are just sort of floating in and floating out. But what I think is powerful is that those that we really remember are the ideas that have form. Let me give you a couple of examples. Imagine if we were walking along outdoors, maybe in a desert, and we came across a sign like this, and it said, "Do not enter. Biochemical hazards exist beyond this point. The risk of severe injury or death is very high and will remain so for the foreseeable future." That's a lot to ponder. Pretty scary. What would happen if we just saw this? Equally scary symbol. I think form has been found very well for this idea that says, "Do not go here." Let's try another one. Here's an idea, Latrodicus Hesperus. What might we be thinking about? What could the idea be here? Is this an old Roman emperor, or what is this? Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's that. Which one has a more visceral impact upon us? Let's try another one. Let's assume that we were for a moment our famous little fox, our verbal mind, as we've been talking about, and we came across this lovely flower, and we spelled it. Well, depending on what language we speak, we might say any one of these things. We could say rose, or we could say rosa. Well, if we were the hummingbird who lacks verbal language, but has plenty of visual language, what might we think? Well, we would just think that. The idea has tremendous visual form. And one more example, let's again pretend that we were our fox and our hummingbird, again our verbal minded. Let's say that someone mentioned to us the word fly. Simple little word, only 3 letters. Well, if we were our fox, we'd say, "Yep, I know immediately what fly means." But if we're our hummingbird, we'd say, I wonder which kind of fly that means. Does it mean to fly a plane? Does it mean a pop fly in baseball? Does it mean to fly like Superman? Does it mean to run really fast? Does it mean flying as a bird would do? Oh, does it mean the insect, the fly? Does it mean to fly as an aircraft does? The question is, for our visual mind, there is a need for us to be able to find the actual form of the idea in order to understand what this sometimes ambiguous verbal description really means. And of course, as our ideas get more and more complicated and more verbal, the problem only gets worse. So what we're going to do, of course, with our visual forest is we're going to move away from the land of lots and lots of words, and we're going to move into this place where we can take a moment and find what is really the essence of our idea from a vivid perspective. And we're going to do that in this place that we call the vivid forest, which, as you remember, is a kind of a metaphorical place in which we have 7 principal ideas. The first one is that any vivid idea, any truly viscerally memorable idea, is both visual and verbal. So that's our central thought. But surrounding that, of course, are our 6 smaller supporting trees in this kind of conceptual grove. The reason I like the idea of the forest is because it gives us a mental place to step away from the complexities of the idea that we're reading or listening to and imagine in our mind's eye, quietly and with some great intent, what is it that we might really be thinking about? And are there other ways, vivid ways, to make our idea more clear? The tool, of course, that we'll use, we introduced last time, is the vivid forest, so named because the central tree, visual and verbal, is surrounded by 7 letters. F, which stands for today's lesson, which is form. A vivid idea has vivid visual form. What do we mean when we talk about form? Well, I mean shape. I mean something that moves away from the cloudy and becomes the specific. Something that has a recognizable, understandable aspect to it that we can look at and say, oh, I think I know what that thing is. I can actually see it. So instead of our idea being a kind of an undifferentiated, very verbose description like coal, our idea becomes absolutely crystal clear. It has absolute shape, clarity, and form. Let me give you a few more examples, because this is where I really enjoy this, where I think form is so powerful in making ideas become real for us. So one of my favorite examples was when I discovered a couple of years ago about the idea of how originally, back in medieval Europe, a long time ago, let's say back in the 13th and 14th century, did scholars at that time give form to the world, because not a whole lot was known in Europe about the world, and it was necessary to give form to the world in order for people to know, well, I live here and someone else lives here, and where would I need to go in order to get there? And so an idea was generated which was called the TO map. The idea being that you could represent the Earth with an O. This is the Earth. And even back in that time, people knew that the world was round. And then you superimpose a T on it to represent the 3 continents that were known at that time. And what we're going to do is orient ourselves literally based on the direction of the sun. And so the sun rises, orients, in the east. So we'll start there with the landmass known as Asia. And then we'll follow the sun as it moves across the map, across the globe, to where it's going to set, which is of course the word Occident, and that's where the sun is going to set. And the sun moves from Asia as it goes across Europe and Africa. And here is what we have called the TO map. The medieval understanding of the shape of the Earth, the form of the Earth, was this: a round circle composed of 3 primary continents, Asia on top, Europe, and Africa at the bottom. And at the apex of all of these was the religious city, of course, of Jerusalem. And it became important to orient us, if we were in Europe, to say, if we want to focus on where religion comes from, we're going to focus on this part of Asia that intersects Africa, Asia, and Europe, the Middle East, Jerusalem. And this became the model for hundreds of years of how the Earth was perceived by people in Europe. And it became so influential that whenever you see a medieval tapestry or a medieval map, it is in fact composed of the TO map. Here is the Earth, the O. Here's the split. Asia on top, Europe, and Africa. And when you see a medieval image of a king or a religious figure holding a sphere in their hands, it's typically a TO map showing that this person, as our leader, has a firm grasp on the true form of the world. I thought that was quite remarkable. I think on a more prosaic basis, something happens to us every time we travel, which is giving form to this craziness of trying to get on an airplane. So let's say we're at the airport. I can't think of a better example of real blah 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 than the kind of thing that comes through the speakers. You know, it's terrible as we're waiting to get on a plane and we're in this big crowd of people, everybody anxious to be the first in line. The poor flight attendant or the gatekeeper starts to say things like, all of you with platinum status or with gold status seated in group 1, please line up. And we know what happens. Nobody lines up properly. Everybody just stands there waiting for their name to be called so that they can get onto the plane. And it is unfortunately a tremendous amount of chaos. It's not much fun. I thought it was pretty interesting. About 3 years ago, one of the more influential airlines from a business perspective here in the United States, which was Southwest, adopted a new system where they actually provided visual form to what goes on in the waiting area before you get on the plane. So what happened is Southwest put up these big signs that list your group. So what happens is we actually have the visual means to see where do we sit in relation to everyone else before we even move on to the plane. And this is what it actually looks like in an airport for anyone who's seen it. The first time we come across this as a way to get on a plane, it's confusing because we've never seen it before. But then next time, if you're ever on Southwest, appreciate it tremendously because it gives us the form a visual model, instead of just having to listen and wonder what it is that they're saying, we can now see where it is that we're supposed to go. And the boarding process now has visual form. Another example, of course, is how might we give form to a long list? A very quick review from last time. As I mentioned, I was doing work for the American Accounting Association, which had written a book on all of the steps necessary to ensure the future of an accounting education. And what we did is we created a form model that was composed of the 7 elements that had been listed in the book in a kind of a honeycomb pattern, making it visually memorable and giving us the chance to move through all 7 of them in order. How do we do this? We already have the tools, and we've been using them before. The tool is going to be our Vivid Grammar Graph. We're going to use a slightly simplified version of the Vivid Grammar Graph, one that we can refer to very quickly. Remember that we had portraits on the top, charts, maps, timelines, flowcharts, and multivariable plots. These are the 6 elemental picture types that we can draw. So here's what we're going to do now. If we start to hear an idea or even think through an idea, and we're thinking it through in words and it remains somewhat cloudy, what we're going to do is we're going to apply the Vivid Grammar Graph on top of that in a very, very specific way in order to find the form of those words. And here's the way we're going to do that. It's going to require some really good listening. So when we hear or read an idea, we're going to listen in that content for what I call verbal triggers. We're going to listen very carefully for certain combinations of words and ideas, because those are the combinations that are going to lead us directly into be able to convert those words into visuals. Let me show you exactly what I mean. Let's say we were listening to a story and someone started out saying, well, there was a man named John. If we hear a name, the picture that we want to draw to give that idea form is we draw a portrait. If we hear a name, we draw a portrait. Let me give you an example. A couple of years ago, it became very, very important for a couple of our leading computer companies. This was about 3 years ago. Let's say one of them was Apple, and the other one was Microsoft, to be able to differentiate the types of computers that their software sold or that they were selling. Because by this point, whereas in the past, years ago, it may have been possible to tell a Mac from a Windows machine just by what it looked like, over the years they'd become very similar. So what was important for Apple in particular was to figure out a way to distinguish themselves from Microsoft. So if you heard 2 names, a Mac and a PC, it became important to come up with a portrait that made the distinction obvious. And that's exactly what Apple did in a very famous advertising campaign. They shifted away from the computers because the computers look the same and shifted to a sort of a portrait of 2 different people. I'm a Mac, I'm a PC. Hey, see the difference? Who do you want to be? Him or him? Became an unbelievably successful advertising campaign for Macintosh. It's an example of a portrait. But if we don't hear a name, if instead we're listening or reading and we hear a big number and we want to give form to that idea, now we draw a chart. Let me give you an example. This was an article that appeared in the New York Times a couple of days ago. It was talking about spending in the United States government. And I'll just read this to you because this is the way the article read. Military spending makes up closer to 24% of federal expenditures today. That's up from a near-term low in 1998 to 2001 when it made up about 20% of federal spending. Interest rates only make up about 6% of the federal budget. In addition, they have been decreasing as a share of the gross domestic product. Federal government spent about 1.5% of GDP in paying interest debt in 2011 and 3.3%. I'm beginning to think, what's going on here? 24%, some years, 20%, 6%, more years, more percent. What is the underlying form of the idea that is trying to be conveyed? Well, why don't we draw a chart? And this was the chart that appeared accompanying the article in the New York Times. And here what we'll have is years, from 1910 up to 2010, so 100 years of time. And here is the percent of federal government spending as a percent of gross domestic product. And we'll see during World War II, red is representing the amount of money spent on defense. So during World War II, we can see that a tremendous amount of money was spent on defense. But that amount has actually gotten much smaller over the years. And we'll see that interest on debt is relatively small. So where is debt increasing? Well, here we see it. Look at this. Since 1950 to 2010, more than half of all of the debt that's been accumulated is coming from entitlement programs. And now we have the form of the underlying idea that says if we seriously want to be able to address the national debt, we absolutely must look at these entitlement programs. So now we have the form of the idea. But there's a different kind of information we might hear, isn't there? Imagine if we were reading or someone was telling us something and we heard a list. There are 3 kinds of people out there, or there are 5 kinds of coffee out there. Now we're not going to draw a chart, nor are we going to draw a portrait. Now we're going to draw a map. When we hear a list, we draw a map. Let me show you an example of this. Recent study I came across testing Americans' perceptions of non-American automobiles. Here's what the text said. Our study compared 7 non-US automobile brands, Mercedes, Audi, Jaguar, Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, and Yugo, by customer response to cost and quality. The winner in the high cost, high quality category was Mercedes, followed by Audi. And I'm thinking, I'm hearing a list. I'm going to be comparing 7 different types of the same thing, and I'm going to be comparing them according to a couple of different criteria. Well, now is the time, if I'm going to hear a list, to draw a map. So the map I might draw is one of our 2x2 consulting maps. And what were the 2 measures? Quality. So let's put on the horizontal axis high quality automobiles versus lower quality automobiles as they're perceived by customers, and cost, expensive versus inexpensive. And we saw that in the category of expensive and high quality, Mercedes took the lead, which was followed shortly by Audi. So now we're creating a map where we can actually begin to see these things. Where did Jaguar sit? Well, Jaguar was considered to be a very expensive car, but of relatively poor quality. So Jaguar, the leaping Jaguar, sits in this category over here. And where did Toyota sit? Toyota was considered to be of high quality and relatively low cost, which is exactly the same place where Honda sat. Hyundai, interestingly, was considered to be of higher quality and even slightly lower cost. So interesting there. And Yugo sat in low quality and low cost. So what we've done is we've taken our list and we've turned it into a map so that now we can actually see what is the relative position and overlap of these different things on a coordinate system where we can see it. This is the form of the idea. These automobile brands are considered most expensive and highest quality, least expensive and lowest quality, and if you're Jaguar, you might want to be worried because you're considered high cost but low quality. We now have the form of the idea. Number 4, if we hear someone relate a history, that is to say a kind of a sequence of events, this happened and then over time this happened, now we draw a timeline. To give form to history, we draw a timeline. Great author, a fellow named Neil Ferguson, British author who's done some really interesting books on history, came out with a book a couple of years ago called The Ascent of Money, which I found quite fascinating. It really is a financial history of the world, and it exposed a lot of ideas that I had not been familiar with. But what the book was not, as well written as it was not vivid. It contained very few images that helped to pull things together. But it does tell history. So what I did is I went through the book as I was reading it, and I made a timeline. And here is the underlying thread that Ferguson makes about the history of money. In the old days, money meant metal. If you had coins, you had money. And then a long time ago was invented this idea of credit, which is actually extending money to people who don't have it because you trust them. And here was the way that Neil Ferguson had mapped out in a timeline perspective the history of money. It started out with banks, which were organizations that could give credit to kings, started primarily by the Medicis. Then came a different type of financial organization, bonds, which extended credit to nations, really largely invented by the Rothschilds. Then came stocks, invented largely by a guy named John Law, which gave credit to businesses. Then came insurance, which gave credit to groups of like-minded individuals, largely influenced by Edward Lloyd, which then gave way to real estate, which is extending the credit to any individual who is perceived to be worthy enough to receive a loan of a significant amount of money, which really got a lot of traction during Roosevelt and the New Deal. And the point of it is, it brings us today to the point where money is really a question of global trust. How much do I trust you to pay back what I've loaned you? And what I thought was fascinating is by putting this into a timeline, the underlying idea of Ferguson's book becomes visible in terms of this form. 2 more to go. If we hear a sequence, something happened which caused something else, which caused something else, which might have gone back and caused something else, this is the trigger for us to know that what we really want to do to find the form of this idea is to draw a flow chart. So here's a funny one. As a kid, we used to have a song that we would sing, and it would go something like this. The foot bone connects to the ankle bone, and the ankle bone connects to the leg bone, and the leg bone connects to the thigh bone, and the thigh bone connects to the butt bone. And by the time we got to the butt bone, everybody was laughing so hard that we didn't know what we were talking about anymore. But the thing is, it was a funny joke, a funny song that played out a kind of a sequence. Well, how would we give form to this? Well, how about we draw a flow chart? Here's what the same thing might look like in visual form. And all of a sudden, this idea of one bone connecting to another bone suddenly starts to have vivid form. And we can see in our mind's eye exactly what it means. Well, let's bring this down a little bit more into serious business thinking. So systems thinking in particular is exactly this model. So systems thinking is the visual representation of the area of one thing influencing another, influencing another, influencing another, and having an impact outside of any one interaction. And really, again, it was one of my heroes, Donella Meadows, who we've talked about a little bit in the past, who really invented this idea of visualizing systems thinking. And the model she used was one of a bathtub, that you have a stock of some sort of resource, you have a source coming in through a control, and a source going out into a dump through another control. And this very simple model of resources coming in and resources flowing out is the flowchart model of describing how a system works. And Meadows and her colleagues were able to apply this systems thinking, this flowchart thinking, to make the form become very visual of many, many different complicated ideas. So in this particular case, they had applied the bathtub model to economic capital constrained by a non-renewable resource. And without going into detail, what it meant was for someone who wanted to follow this flowchart, it was possible to discern what was going to happen in a closed system where there was one resource which was not renewable, and how might that map out. And out of this, of course, they built very complicated computer models and systems that showed the form of the sequence. Which brings us to our last one. The last one is if we're reading something, or if someone's telling us a story, and we start to hear a whole stew of details. There's time, and there's money, and there are lists, and there are people, and there are places, and there are destinations. A whole lot of things. Well, now we have no choice, but we have to start to draw our famous multivariable plot. A single image which is going to be able to pull together all of the different variables that we've heard. And a quick example. This looks like a bunch of different variables to me. E equals mc squared. One of the most famous equations ever, which very few people, myself included, really have a tremendous understanding of what it means. So let's see if we can't start to build a multivariable plot that takes care of this sort of stew of variables and turns it into something vivid. Well, E obviously stands for energy, mass, stands for the mass of an object, and c stands for the speed of light times itself. Okay, so now we've started to get a little bit of a sense of at least what the equation meant, but what does it really mean? We're not going to go into the theory of relativity now, but for anybody who's interested, I did have a chance to go through and break down the charts in that famous chapter 7 and blah blah blah, and here's the high-level multivariable plot summary. A long time ago, mathematician Euclid realized that we could map out things on planes. The universe could be mapped out in a planar model. And then along came René Descartes, who said, you know what? Not only can things be put on planes, but things can be put in Cartesian coordinates. We can actually map the universe out according to x's and y's and the relative position of items within the universe relative to each other. And then Newton came along building on that model and said, not only can we plot everything out using these Cartesian coordinates and Euclidean planes, but we can actually apply Newtonian mechanics on top of those and understand in a rational mathematical way exactly the force of one object upon another and how will they interact within this model. So the beauty of it was, after these gentlemen had done their work and many thousands of others had applied it, a general sense that the universe was more or less a fixed kind of a three-dimensional cube that had Newtonian physics operating in Cartesian coordinates on Euclidean planes. And then along came Einstein with his old E equals mc squared and said, guess what? The universe is actually very fluid. And by the way, it's all relative. Where we thought things were may or may not be where they are, depending on where we're looking at them and our own speed. And if you're interested in how we can turn this into a multivariable plot, again, check out blah 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 chapter 7. The result, of course, of having been through this exercise, highly conceptual, but I think a tremendous amount of fun and also something very insightful, is we take and we find the form of an otherwise cloudy, unmemorable idea. We make it vivid, we make it visceral, and we make it memorable. All we have to do is refer back to our grammar graph and say, depending on what I heard, what picture would I use? That helps me draw the form of my idea. A little bit of homework for all of you to move beyond the conceptual and start to apply this to ideas you might come across. Here's the homework I'd like you to work on over the next 2 weeks. Let's practice finding form, and here's what I'd like you to do. I would like you to select a favorite passage from a book. It could be a book of fiction, it could be nonfiction, it could be a science book, something that you've always enjoyed and think that you understand. And what I'd like you to do is take that piece of text and see if you can apply the grammar graph to finding the underlying form of that idea. Is the form going to be a portrait comparing two things to each other? Is the form going to be a chart which gives us some visual insight? Is the form going to be a map that shows us the overlap of different ideas? What might the form of that idea be? And draw us a picture of that form. And now what I'd like to do is share student work from last week. Hi Shivanan, how are you doing?
Good.
Okay, so quick review. The homework was to practice drawing the visual forest, and you selected the best things in life are free and decided to draw 3 pictures. So let's go through those and tell us a little bit about what you picked, and let's take a look.
Yeah, so the best thing in life are free. One is the oxygen, we get free.
Oxygen, okay. It is free, isn't it?
Yes.
So tell us about this first picture.
Yeah, first picture I tried to think about the form of oxygen. It is invisible, it is formless. So the best way I thought to give it a form is to draw the molecule or the atomic structure of oxygen. So I have drawn the atom there, atomic with nucleus,
Wonderful.
Electrons, and inner electronic shell. Then I thought, how can I recognize oxygen? I mean, how do we normally recognize it? So normally if I see a cylinder, oxygen, then I think, oh, there's oxygen present in that. So that way I recognize oxygen.
Very good. So now we can see it. This is in fact the way probably most of us think about oxygen as a thing.
Yeah. Then how targeted this oxygen is. So, for example, the oxygen now it's generated by trees using photosynthesis, and then it's in the air. Then we respirate and we breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. Then it goes to the trees, and then again the cycle starts. So that's how the target is for the oxygen.
Shivanand, this is brilliant. What a wonderful way to take something as undefinable as oxygen and be able to begin to make it become vivid. So you applied, let's review really quickly, you applied three. You applied form, which is very similar to what we were doing today. What is the underlying structure of this? You applied recognizable, so how do we tend to view oxygen and what does it trigger in our mind? And targeted, I think this is an interesting one. The oxygen targets us so that we can breathe it out and target back to the trees. Very nicely done, Shivanand. I want to thank you for that. And next, John, I think you did a different topic. John, you should be able to hear me now. Can you hear me?
I hear you loud and clear, Dan. Good morning.
Okay, John, so why don't you take us through which one you'd picked?
Well, I chose the third one, Dan. A dog is a human's best friend. And I just started off with the thought of, what does a dog mean to me or to anybody? And a lot of thoughts came to mind. So I actually wanted to take the Vivid Forest principles and work with each one of them and try and come up with my own visual. So in the top right hand you see the word form, and sometimes we draw a house or a square or a box. So I thought, okay, let me draw a dog house for the form that's going to suggest the idea of a dog, because I'm all the time trying to go back to the essential visual that's going to be the final presentation. The second principle was only enough, the O of the forest, and I thought, all right, what's something that's very essential or only enough? Okay, a bone. Then I thought, okay, the bare bones relates to a dog, so there's the second principle of the forest. Then thirdly, what is recognizable, and some image of a dog looking at itself or a puppy looking at itself in the mirror. The fourth principle is the evolving concept.
Good.
And I used the concept of a cave drawing and a dog or a wolf, and then that just suggested to me the idea of the evolution of the feral, which is a word that means wild. Then the fifth principle of spanning differences, I just thought of a wolf, and I thought, okay, what's contrasting to a wolf? Okay, some sort of friendly puppy. And so that's the concept of spanning differences from a mild animal and a wild animal contained in the same visual. Then finally, the sixth principle of the forest was targeted, and I just thought of a hunting dog in a pointing position, and so I just added the phrase, pointed in the right direction.
This is a fantastic piece of work. And then you concluded with an image I wasn't familiar with, and I thought I should add this one in.
Yes, this is Sir Edward Landseer's painting called The Old Shepherd's Chief Mourner. These images are very strong. You see the dog in the resting position on this gold cloth, and you see the coffin underneath him, captured the essence of a dog as a human's best friend.
Wonderful. Well, that's a very, very vivid way to summarize it with that last picture particularly. Hey, thank you all for another great lesson. This is Dan signing off from the Napkin Academy, but don't go away. Now on our new platform, you can still submit your homework. Debbie, our community manager, is going to join you right now to show you exactly how to do that, and I really encourage you, do your homework. Okay, take it away, Debbie. See you soon.
We hope you enjoyed this Napkin Academy classic video. We've made it easier than ever to share your homework. After you've completed your homework and have a JPEG or PNG file saved on your computer, come back to this course. Once you're back here, scroll to the bottom of the screen, and in the comments box, you can add a comment. I'm just going to call this one My Homework. You can also add images by clicking on the Insert Edit Image button here. In the source box, click on the file. In the Images window, click on Upload, and then click on Add Files. This is going to take you to your computer where you can search for your images. I'm just going to search for mine in Pictures, and I'm going to choose this image here. You can also add multiple images here. Click Upload. After the upload is complete, click Close. Then scroll down and you'll see that the last image is here and it's checked. This is the one we just uploaded. Click Insert. I suggest in the dimensions box you change the maximum to 1200 pixels and leave the constrained proportions box checked. You can also add an image description here if you'd like. Click OK. You'll see that your image has been added to your comment. And now the last step, the most important one, make sure that you click the green comment button here to upload your homework to the Napkin Academy. We hope to see your homework soon.